Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining me while I present the topic regarding Australia and New Zealand, the importation, the storage, distribution, and accessibility of medical cannabis products within these two jurisdictions. So before I start my presentation, I wanted to give a quick overview as to who I am and the company I work with. My name is Adam Miller. I work with MediPharm Labs. We are a manufacturer of pharmaceutical preparations of cannabinoid products, and I work with the company as head of strategic accounts. So today I want to give an overview regarding the Australian and the New Zealand registration, importation, and accessibility frameworks for the medical cannabis industries. So I'm going to cover, as I mentioned, these two jurisdictions. And at the end of my presentation, there will be time for question and answering. So let's start with Australia. So I'll give a very quick overview of the Australian landscape as it exists today. So in 2016, the federal government created an amendment to the legislation around the Drugs and Narcotics Act, to be specific, to allow for the domestic cultivation and production of medical cannabis products. In 2017, the government then rescheduled cannabis products, THC and CBD cannabinoids to be specific, to what is defined as Schedule 4 and Schedule 8 classifications, meaning that drugs are no longer prohibited, they are now controlled and accessible via prescription. In 2018, the government also allowed for exporting of medical cannabis products to legal jurisdictions internationally. And in more recent times, roughly 2020, the federal government created amendments to the licensing scheme, which allows companies to access the right to grow, cultivate, or manufacture and process medical cannabis products. And most recently, the amendment around scheduling of CBD as a prescription-only medicine was changed to an S3 category, meaning that it can be prescribed or accessible via a pharmacist oversight. And I'll talk about that a little later in the presentation. New Zealand. So in New Zealand, in 2018, the Misuse of Drugs Act was amended to allow for medical cannabis. And this first specific change allowed for the importation of medical cannabis products into New Zealand by licensed importers, storage providers, and wholesalers. However, in 2019 to 2020, further regulatory amendments were made to allow for the domestic cultivation and manufacturing of medical cannabis products by New Zealand-based companies. So let's take a moment to talk about the importation and exportation schemes for each of these jurisdictions. In Australia, in order to import a product into the country, a company must first off be licensed to import the product into the country and store it and warehouse it. However, in order to do this, they need to adhere to what's called TGO 93. TGO 93 is a testing declaration which is built around the European pharmacopoeia. And basically what it is, it's a form that a company will fill out, a declaration that they will sign off on, which ensures that the product that they're bringing in meets certain specifications around the microbial testing, the pesticide testings, the specific providing of certificates of analysis for both the raw material and the finished product, assays for the ingredients, so the ability to test for the THC and CBD compounds, of course, ICH guideline stability protocols, as well as compliant products with the appropriate amount of heavy metals, pesticides, and so on. So this is a declaration, and it only needs to be signed by a company in order to bring the product into Australia. This is something that the government has done to empower the industry to bring products in at their own accord. And it's vastly different to what occurs in New Zealand. So in Australia, the government's taken an approach where they give the industry the responsibility to fill out this information. Whereas in New Zealand, it's slightly different. The government, the Ministry of Health, have taken a slightly different approach. rather than put the responsibility into the hand of industry, a company will need to register the product with the Ministry of Health, which is a much more technically complicated process because there is a lot of documentation that needs to be provided. So in New Zealand, a Module 3 dossier will be required as a minimum for the registration process into the country. As well as that, there is a roughly $30,000 registration fee for a product to go into market. So within that registration, the company will need to provide the ministry the information about the source material, so validating the entire supply chain, ensuring that there is quality standards and procedures that ensure that the products are traceable and trackable. GMP certificates across the entire supply chain. So that starts from your extraction and decarboxylation steps, which is heating the plant up, as well as the purification, formulating, and finishing steps to create the finished product. As well as that, the bottles, caps, and cartons that are used need to come from a verified and quality checked facility, as well as the content information slips that are provided, the CMIs. Further to that, stability is an essential shelf life application under ICH guidelines, as well as sample retention batches. So having a minimum of 3 COAs that are available for presentation upon application, as well as alignment of lab testing requirements to the New Zealand monograph specifications. So 2 similar yet vastly different processes, because one is industry dependent, meaning the company will sign off, and the other is government dependent, meaning the government body will assess the application and ensure that it meets those guidelines for a product to be registered into New Zealand. To date, there has only been one company that has been successful with their registration, but there are others like MediPharm Labs who are going through that process with their clients. So now I'm going to briefly speak to you about storage, access, and distribution within these 2 jurisdictions. So I've created a map here which outlines how the product gets into market, how it is prescribed within the market, and how it is dispensed to patients within each of these jurisdictions. So I briefly just touched upon the importation process. Goods are imported into the country, or they are locally produced. Australia now has a larger variety of companies that are producing products locally, because the time frame that Australia has been operational has been longer than New Zealand, but there are a number of companies in New Zealand that are now cultivating and looking to manufacture. So there are a small number of companies that are now actually harvesting their flower in New Zealand. So as I mentioned before, in Australia, any locally produced product must meet GMP as a minimum manufacturing or cultivation/manufacturing requirement. However, imported products do not necessarily need to meet that same standard. New Zealand, as I mentioned, all locally produced products must be GMP certified, as well as all imported products must be GMP certified. However, there is a catch for both these markets. In New Zealand, a doctor can personally import a product from any jurisdiction. And in Australia, there is a loophole around compounding pharmacies being able to custom formulate with material that they have imported in bulk. But I won't touch on that in this presentation, but I'm happy to answer questions on that after the talk. So after the product's imported or it's locally produced, it is stored in a licensed storage facility that is able to store and then licensed for wholesale, meaning that they are able to legally supply these medicines. So in both Australia and New Zealand, THC and CBD have different classifications. In Australia, for example, THC is a Schedule 8 narcotic and CBD is a Schedule 4. And these require different license types. And this is the same in New Zealand. However, in New Zealand, you are required to have a GMP warehousing facility to store these medicines. Then the goods are prescribed by a doctor in both countries. So the difference between the 2 markets, in Australia, the doctor must apply to the federal government for an authorization to write a prescription for their patients, whereas in New Zealand, the doctor is able to prescribe at their own discretion. So there's no ministry oversight over the prescribing process, which means that New Zealand doctors have a lot more flexibility with their prescribing, whereas in Australia it is more tightly regulated and there's a higher oversight for accessibility. Then from a distribution perspective, products, once they have been prescribed in both countries, are distributed to a local pharmacy. Pharmacy cannot store bulk amounts of material on site. The pharmacy then will apply the relevant labels to the medicines, and then they will dispense the medicines to the patients whom will report back to their physician for ongoing maintenance. So now I'm briefly going to talk about the future of the Australian and New Zealand markets. So there's a consistent thread I'm seeing internationally, but on the Australian and New Zealand side, you're starting to see consolidations across the Australian market in particular. Two notable recent acquisitions were ECS Botanics of Murray Meds, a cultivation company based in Victoria, and Ozcan purchasing Campal, a dedicated pharmaceutical company focused on cannabinoid products for pets. So you're going to start to see more consolidations over the coming years across Australia and New Zealand. You'll also see an oversupply of flower material across both these countries as more cultivators are becoming operational. And as a result, you will see a price decline across these markets for commodity cannabinoids like THC and CBD. However, it does give rise to novelty cannabinoids like CBN, CBG, and CBC, which are becoming more popular in places like Canada. MediPharm Labs recently introduced a CBN product into the Canadian market, and there are companies in New Zealand like Puro that have CBG flower material. And you'll see these products coming into the market over the coming years. As well as this, there will be a strict or a tightening of regulatory requirements in each market. So in Australia, it's very likely in the coming months that the importation scheme will change to become more similar to New Zealand, where a registration will be required and GMP will be a minimum requirement for all products entering into market. Further to this, the rescheduling of CBD in New Zealand might occur in the coming years. Currently, CBD is treated as a medicine. However, in Australia, for example, it has been rescheduled to a Schedule 3, meaning it can be accessed as a pharmacy. However, we're a few years away from that because companies must conduct clinical trials. I, however, predict that New Zealand will even allow for lower dose CBD without any type of clinical efficacy for those products, treating it like a supplement or a vitamin. And finally, in both markets, you'll see an increased prescriber base as more doctors become familiar with prescribing and a rise in digital clinics. So over the COVID period, telehealth has become a much more popular service. And as a result, you will see more companies moving towards digital clinics and cannabis companies purchasing or investing within these digital clinics. And on the uptake of doctors, currently there are about 150 prescribers that are what you call authorized prescribers in Australia, meaning these doctors can prescribe products at their own discretion as long as they've been approved by the government. And in the July to December period of 2020, more than 7,500 patients were prescribed cannabis through this authorized prescriber scheme in Australia. In Australia, also, you will see a rise of patients. We're currently sitting at around 35 to 45,000. That should increase to around 70 to 80,000 by the end of 2021. Further to that, across the global cannabis industry, I predict that you're going to see a much greater emphasis on a pharmaceutical styled industry, more catalyst towards pharmaceutical drivers to turn the industry towards a more stricter medical model. And this is happening because medical cannabis could poach a significant number of pharmaceutical sales, around 4 billion annually in the US alone. As well as that, a survey conducted in the US showed that of the 1,300 consumers that were using cannabis, 80% of those using cannabis had replaced their pharmaceutical medicine. So as a result of these types of figures, you're seeing more of a migration towards a stricter medical model across the pharmaceutical/cannabis industry. And that can be seen today with a number of cannabis pharmaceutical interactions, the most noticeable being Jazz and the acquisition of GW Pharmaceutical, MediPharm Labs collaboration and supply to Stada, a large German pharmaceutical company, and in 2018, Novartis and the LOI with Tilray, which hasn't eventuated, but it is a good signal that pharmaceuticals are starting to become more involved within the cannabis space. And that is it for my presentation. I hope you enjoyed. If you have any further questions, by all means, I'll be sticking around to answer anything regarding the Australian and New Zealand regulatory and cannabis access framework. Thank you.